If you're tired of hearing about how men are the problem, but hardly ever any solutions to fix the problem, then stick around to understand the roots of men's issues a bit better and to leave with some tangible ideas to start fixing them.
I don't think toxic masculinity is accurate of what is going on. Human beings in general don't generally start doing behaviors because it's harmful. We tend to do things because they're adaptive, they're survival strategies based on our environment around us.
This one's for the boys, and about the boys, and the men. We hear a lot about how society favors men, but all the headlines about men's issues like high levels of loneliness, suicide, addiction, and violence highlight the fact that society has also failed men in many ways and for a long time. So today I'm speaking with Dr. Brandon from Remasculine and the This Triggers Me podcast. He's a sociologist and consultant specializing in the social, emotional development and well-being of boys and men, and he's going to help us understand how society fails boys and men and what we can do about it so that men and everyone around them can lead the best lives possible.
Let my breath brush your ears. Inhale these words. May they fill your lungs and the atmosphere.
Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of the subject with maybe one of the most surprising pieces of information that you share about young boys, and it's that boys need more emotional guidance than they are currently getting, and they are actually more sensitive than girls. That, like I said, that was very surprising to me because I think we're kind of told the opposite. So is that new? Is that a cultural change from a time when boys were tougher than girls, or were boys always that way and we just didn't know?
That's a great question. To summarize, I guess there's so many different ways to approach that, is that there's actually biological evidence that boys tend to be more susceptible to their environments. Even from babies, boys are more likely to die from different diseases or different illnesses as infants. They're less hardy than girls are on average. But where this gets confusing around emotions is that around the age of 5, that's when boys become less facially expressive than girls on average. But when we've done studies, and these studies go back to like the 70s, they find that boys' reactions to what's going on around them are often higher than girls or higher than women's. And so for a couple examples, one, if you ask Americans, is it easier to raise a boy or girl? And I'm sure this is similar in most of the global north. But if you ask Americans, do you think raising a boy or girl is easier? What do you think most people would say?
Boys.
Yes. And so most people say boys. And the reason for that is they particularly think that teenage girls are far more emotional than teenage boys are. And if anything, if you're going to argue the question is like, yeah, absolutely. Boys show less emotional expression in so many different ways. But their bodies actually often hold more emotional distress. And so, research shows that boys actually need more guidance, even though they're given less emotional guidance. And in countries where boys are prioritized, like to the detriment of girls, like where boys are like the favored child in society, they actually score higher as teenagers on levels of emotional maturity than girls do. So in those cultures where they're given so much priority and focus, they actually can be socialized to have way higher emotional maturity than we often assume, and have like a low bar for the emotional maturity of teenage boys in the global north. However, I think one study that I think illustrates this really well is an older study, but they've done similar studies in adults. But they took like 5-year-old boys and girls, and they took them to the room kind of with researchers, and like they could play with certain things, but there was a baby monitor in that room. And the children were told, there might be a baby in the other room who might cry at some point, and here are your options. You can like talk back through the baby monitor to this baby. You can kind of knock on the door, ask for a researcher to help, or you can turn off the baby monitor to kind of ignore the baby crying. And so then the researchers left the room, and these children one by one were in the room playing, and then they heard the baby crying, and it's not a real baby, it's just the recording. And boys were way more likely to turn off the baby monitor. And so you could look at that from an outside perspective and be like, oh, what a bunch of calloused boys that they were more likely to ignore the baby crying. But as good research does, they were not just monitoring their behavior observations. They also had like measuring their skin conductivity, which shows how much anxiety you go under. It also measured your heart rate, which also can show how much stress you're under. And boys, after they turned off the speakers, you might assume like their face, their affect is showing nothing much going on, but their distress actually stayed the same, if not went a bit higher. So they actually experienced like more distress even when they ignored it. And they looked a bit more deeper into the rationale of like, okay, why did some kids turn off the speaker and why did other kids go try to talk and go for help? And yes, there was a gender difference, but it was actually deeper than that. It was the fact that the children who were more able to like be equipped to know what to do with a crying baby were the ones that experienced like when they went to see an adult or to talk back to the baby, their nervous systems were much more regulated. And so it was more that the children who had strategies and knew what to do in those situations, those were the ones that were able to handle the emotional distress of other people's emotional distress more.
Okay, so yeah, they basically just froze and didn't know what to do with the crying baby.
In a sense, they might have, like, we know that boys are less socialized in nurturing roles. Even the types of toys that people tend to give them are much more about spatial tactile awareness, as opposed to girls are given much more relational toys. So absolutely, that could be a huge factor in it. And with adult men versus adult women, we have similar tests where they're watching videos, little clips of videos designed to elicit a specific emotion. So like a horror, something to make them scared, something to make them like feel joy, angry. And they ask men versus women, like, how did you feel watching that? And generally speaking, men tend to underreport how much their emotions felt. Like, there's like, oh, it didn't impact me much at all. Whereas women are way more likely to say like, oh yeah, I felt emotional by this. But then the body tells almost the exact opposite stories, that women's bodies are actually have less emotional reaction, less heart rate increases, less clammy skin, which can be a sign of stress, than men do. So men underreport, and this starts at a really young age of like downplaying your emotions. Some people interpret that as men lying about their emotional experience, but I would say it's more of a disconnect, that men have a disconnect between how emotions exist in their body versus what they think their response to emotions should be.
Yeah, my first assumption was that maybe they not even underreport, they under-identify. Like they don't even like perceive what's happening, and they can't put words. If you can't name something, you can't speak about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And research shows around the age of 3, boys, that's when boys become less verbally expressive than girls. Prior to that, boys from newborn infancy actually have more verbal expressions of fussiness as well as joy than girls on average. But around language formation, around 2 to 3, that's when girls outpace boys. And they've done research of parents of any gender are less likely to use emotional language when talking to their sons compared to their daughters, especially around sad or scary events. And so they're less likely to use emotional language. And why that matters is because a huge ability for you to regulate your emotions is being able to accurately name it. And so I would argue boys often have a skewed and distorted relationship with 3 emotions at a very early age, and that's fear, sadness, and anger. Because people also tend to assume if they think it's a boy, what they do is they take, again, toddlers, and they swap a male and female toddler into opposite stereotypical clothing. And then they observe how the adults respond to them differently. And when they think it's a boy that's crying, adults tend to assume that that boy is angry. And they tend to use less they tend to have a harsher tone in their own voice, and they're less likely to use physical proximity as a way to comfort. And we know one of the best ways to actually help children regulate their emotions is co-regulation. So being next and nearby a really regulated nervous system would be really important. So boys at a very young age are often cut off from, I would say, they have a distorted relationship, with 3 main emotions.
Okay, well, that's so sad. And then these boys grow into men, and I'm gonna illustrate what happens maybe with a thread that you posted a few months ago, I think, on your Instagram stories. It was a man who said, I don't relate to grown men who think they need to heal. I've never given enough of a fuck to be traumatized by anything. But then again, I'm not a bitch. And you replied, do you remember how old you were when you stopped giving enough of a fuck to be traumatized? So this response of yours implies that boys do indeed give a fuck and feel things, but stop caring at some point or suppress their emotions. Why do boys start doing that? What reasons have you heard in your work? And how early do they experience this disconnection from themselves? Although you just said that it can be as early as 3 years old, but and I understand that there are a lot of layers to that, the language part, but also then when they're a bit older, socialization with classmates, and so I know it's a broad question, but yeah, generally, why do boys start suppressing their emotions and hiding that part of themselves?
Absolutely. Human beings in general don't generally start doing behaviors because it's harmful. We tend to do things because they're adaptive, they're survival strategies based on our environment around us. And so when boys and men start suppressing their emotions, I did mention, as you did, that it happens really early, but that's usually not the age that men reflect back upon. They don't really remember 3 to 5 as being those pivotal moments. There is absolutely some that do. But one of the biggest assumptions I had in my PhD research was that I interviewed the most emotionally expressive grade 12 boys and the least emotionally expressive grade 12 boys. When I talked to the least emotionally expressive, I thought when I asked them to reflect upon their relationship with emotions, I thought some of them would just say, this is just who I am. I've always been this way. But none of them said that. They all knew when and why they started to suppress their emotions. And that was, generally speaking, between grades around 7, 8, 9, grade 7, 8, 9, the transition to high school.
What age is that?
That's like 13, 14, 15. So that time period, the 3 main reasons why boys suppress their emotions, numbered 1 and 2 were tied in my own research, but this holds true to so many men and boys that I work with since my PhD research as well. Fear of judgment, being seen as weak, viewing emotions as a weakness. And then tied with that was fear of burdening others. So like there's other people going through enough difficulty as it is. I don't want to add to their plate. Parents' divorce is often a factor in that. Like my parents, I need to just show up so that my younger siblings or that my parents can get through this. I don't want to add to their plate. And the boys themselves believe that the pressures around masculinity were connected to the first 2. They didn't think that on the third one. And I would agree that the third one just seems more of a trauma response to pain. But I would call that past experiences creates a fear of future loss, meaning those boys had been emotionally close to someone in their lives. And whether that was that person dying, and sometimes it was just a best friend moving away in like grade 5 or 6, and the parents never really did anything to like bring closure to that experience. It was just all of a sudden my friend was gone from school and he moved 9 hours away and never saw him again. And they're like, I don't want to get close to someone again in the future because I know what that's like and I know how painful it is. And so it's like a self-protective measure. And so I think when we talk about men who have really suppressed their emotions based on maybe their environment wasn't safe to actually express their emotions, I think there's this nuance here where we can kind of sometimes make fun of men for why they've suppressed their emotions, being like, you gotta just express it, not realizing how much was out of care, not realizing how much was out of self-protection. And I think that sometimes we can be a bit shame heavy around men's emotional expression without understanding how it was really helpful for them. And it's no longer serving them. Like my question for men is this, I often use this short poem by Rupi Kaur. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her,
Yep.
but she has a poem that says, we are in survival mode long after we needed to be. So my short answer to your question is, Why do boys and men start suppressing their emotions? Because they're in survival mode, and their constant growth journey is to assess, am I still in survival mode?
I have a lot of compassion for that because
Mm.
as a very sensitive and expressive person, I can't imagine what it would be like to have learned not to be that way and to have to suppress all of that. So yeah.
My own opinion based on my work, it's not empirical, it's more anecdotal, but I would argue that the most emotionally restricted boys and men are often some of the most emotionally sensitive. And part of what I see is that they might not have language around all of their emotions, but they are deeply focused on the emotional frequency of everyone else in the room. And yeah, it can lead to some really negative outcomes, like suppressing your emotions prolonged for any gender is like deeply causationally related to higher rates of heart disease later on in life, because our heart's working harder because emotions exist inside our body as well. And so there's a clarity that I want to offer here too when I was talking about shame, is there's a difference between wielding shame as a weapon versus men might feel shame even if they're called in a loving way. So like calling in men to get connected with their emotions might increase some shame for people, but that's not wielding shame in a negative way. It's more like, yeah, men need to sit with their own shame. For all humans need to sit. We need to assess when we experience shame, how much of it is deserved and how much can we interpret and be like, okay, there's like a little truth here that I want to work on to grow and to change and transform.
You said the word, but I want to talk about masculinity, and I think we need to define the word masculinity. I've heard you say that boys and men assume that other boys and men are going to bully them if they express emotions or show signs of what would be deemed as weakness, but that's not actually true. In other words, boys and men assume others are more sexist than they are. So if men make that wrong assumption about other men who make that same wrong assumption about other men, isn't masculinity like just a myth? Does anyone really know what it is?
So first, let me clarify, because one of those things is true, one of them isn't, is that boys and men absolutely can bully other boys and men for the levels of emotional expression. Fact research shows that part of the reason why even adults want to kind of suppress and control boys as boys who break out of a more rigid mold is because they fear that they're going to get bullied more if they are more emotionally expressive or have traits that are deemed more feminine. There's research that shows that, yeah, they are more likely to get bullied and policed more for that. So that's absolutely true. But what I have said, I think what you're alluding to is that almost every single teenage boy and man, but teenage boys especially, they want more emotional depth in their male relationships, but almost all of them think that none of their other male friends want the same thing. So in that way, they're kind of stuck in a cage of their own making. Everyone's stuck in this cage, and everyone thinks everyone else is stuck in this cage, and no one's brave enough to be like that child in that famous fable of the emperor has no clothes. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Just to call it like, hey, so many of you actually want emotional connection with each other. Let's do this together. And yes, and the research that boys and men tend to think their friends or the other men are more sexist than they are. Because they personally might not, actually, so many boys and men, like their personal values, they don't align with the types of jokes or humors that they hear out there. But if no one in their peer group says anything, then they interpret that everyone else is just okay with this. And so it's like, okay, even though I'm not personally okay with it, you kind of just think everyone else is okay with it. And then your own distance between your values and then what you say, that becomes more out of integrity and out of alignment, because everyone's just thinking everyone is in the same boat. And it's like, we should realize, boys and men should realize that you almost all are in the same boat, where most of, in my research, I called these reluctant adherers. So there was 3 groups. I know I haven't talked about masculinity yet, and I'll do that in a moment. But there was like the reluctant adherers were the largest group. Those are the ones who like the pressures associated with being a man. And the 3 most harmful pressures are suppress your emotions, be hyper independent, and be dominant. They viewed those things as like, I don't like these things, but I feel stuck. Either I don't know how to change, or I don't think that the cost of changing outweighs the benefits of staying hidden inside this cage. Then you have the willing adherers who look at those three messages and they're like, this is awesome. This is the man I want to be. And this is what I think I should be like. And so I'm going to do this. And then you have the resistors, those that look at those three messages, don't like them, and break out of the cage. And so then in talking what masculinity is, obviously a very controversial topic, but people tend to agree on what the definition is. So masculinity are beliefs, behaviors, and roles commonly associated with the male sex. Where people disagree upon is how much and if they're fully biologically rooted, are they socially constructed, or I use this Venn diagram of spiritual realities. So are they biological, social, or spiritual realities? And I would argue that most people have like some sort of overlap between those circles. If you were to go on, or let me just illustrate this with the most common gender roles associated with the male sex are protector and provider. So someone who's in the biological standpoint would say, okay, men on average have greater muscle mass. And so their roles of protector and provider is a result of their biology being like, okay, they're better at hunting bigger animals, more strength for stabbing. So that is why they have those roles. And someone who's from a socially constructed point of view would say that protector and provider, we just have constructed what those mean. So we mean protector as physical protection, but we look at provider as financial provision nowadays. But these things change over time. Or for instance, do you know what the number one cause of death of pregnant women in the United States is?
No.
It's injuries related to domestic violence and gunshots from their partner. So if you look at that stat and be like, oh, are men protectors here? Like you can redefine the terms protectors and providers in so many different ways. And so that would be like socially constructed, that you've constructed this idea of men as protectors and providers and women as caregivers and nurturers. But how I like to look at all of those things is that protecting, providing, caregiving, and nurturing, to me, those all have the same foundation, which is like the point of them in a healthy way is to build safety. And so we have different language for constructing what we mean by building safety. And you could easily untangle masculinity from a social constructionist point of view. And then the spiritual point of view would say, like, there's the more rigid side, which would say, like, okay, it's God-given, men are leaders in this way. And then you have like a more fluid level of spirituality, which could be like indigenous people, like two-spirited. Or it could be even like Carl Jungian, the anima and animus, that there's a feminine that lives inside the masculine and there's a masculine that lives inside the feminine. And so
it's more symbolic than...
Yeah, it's archetypal, it's symbolic. And so I like using that model to be like, okay, it's a continuum from really fixed to really much more flexible. And I'm, maybe because I'm formerly a biology teacher, I'm not a full social constructionist, that I think biology plays a role. But at the same time, I'm okay with someone else having a different perspective than me in this. Like, I don't actually think that everyone needs to be an exact same part of this continuum. I would more care about, does your belief in here, does it really harm yourself and others or lead to more flourishing?
I like that you insist on the fact that this question is what matters, because it's really not a debate that can be had, because unless we can do a very unethical thing, that would be to study babies, or even like babies before they're even born, to see what happens biologically, and then we isolate them from any type of cultural influence. That will never happen. So trying to see if biology plays a role obviously is super interesting, but I don't think we'll ever have the laws that allow us to do that, to determine that. So I think it's much more efficient and constructive to focus on that question, on however you see it. Is it helpful for you or is it harmful? I think it's a much better question. I mean, it's also interesting to study the biological aspect of it, but there will be some frontier that we cannot cross.
Yeah, they unfortunately like they have done some studies that would 100% be unethical now. But yeah, when we're trying to play the position of like testing for all these variables, it leads to dangerous outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we're going to talk about why Brendan doesn't like or use the term toxic masculinity. But first, here's some important information about the show in case you're new here. If you know the drill, just skip about a minute. Do you ever feel like every important conversation turns into just another petty debate and that we deserve better? Well, welcome to Make Sense, the show where I, singer-songwriter Leïla Six, interview people with super relevant and important insight to put our ideologies aside and make the most efficient decisions to build societies that actually make sense based on our shared values. I believe these are freedom and safety, which for humans comes from community. And by the way, whether you look at it scientifically or spiritually, community includes the entire planet. But these values can sometimes be a bit conflicting, which is tricky. So how can we shape a world that's both safe and exciting for everyone and on the largest scale possible? Well, that's a tough question and an ambitious goal, and it would be easy to get cynical about it and just say, well, the world's unfair, so I'll fight for my share and F the rest. But I don't want to do that, and I'm sure you don't either. So we need to understand topics that are fundamental to how the world works, complex topics that require our attention if we want to stay true to our values. Now, I tell all of my guests that I only want to have constructive, snark-free conversations here because I want everyone to feel welcome to learn, feel, and grow. So I'll ask the same of you in the comment section. Now, all that's been said, let's use our senses to make sense of the world and create more sensible societies. I know, it's too much wordplay, but I had to. I know you don't like the term toxic masculinity. Can you explain what's wrong with that term and which term you prefer to use instead and why? I think it's a very interesting take.
Sure. Can I actually defend it first? I never have done that
Absolutely.
before.
Yeah. I've never heard you do that. Go ahead.
So I'll defend it based on one person at a talk I did who was very angry at me because I don't use the term toxic masculinity. And so I want to represent their position because I think it's worth representing. They felt that by me not using the word, it diminished the harm that they've experienced in life from men in their life. And so I think toxic is a term that gets to the gravity of what some people have experienced. I think they can perceive that I'm doing like as a whitewashing of like the harm or trying to bypass that people have experienced actual trauma and abuse at the hands of men. So I'm not avoiding the term for that word. I don't think toxic masculinity is accurate of what is going on. I think what I prefer, I use restrictive masculinity or restrictive forms of masculinity because I think that's the upstream. And of course, the more restricted you can, that can lead to toxic behaviors. But what I would say is that when masculinity becomes harmful, when beliefs, behaviors, or roles associated with types of masculinity become harmful is when they're rigid and restrictive. Rigid in the sense they have to be that way all the time, and restrictive in the sense that the way that you have to be is one way. Like there's multiple ways to be a man. There's multiple ways that we express masculinity. And if you think there's just one way and what the way is, you have to be that way all the time, that's really harmful. And as I said, the three most harmful things are need to suppress emotion, need to be hyper-independent, and need to be dominant. And so those three things are the restrictive start that leads to like a host of negative intrapersonal psychological outcomes, like boys and men's own suicide, mental health, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, drug use, alcohol misuse. It also impacts your relationship with others. This actually has almost some of the most buy-in from the work I do with boys and men is like, the more you adhere to those three things, the more you have higher conflict in your relationships, less satisfaction being a father. And I know so many boys want to be a father one day. And I also know so many boys I talk to when I ask them about their relationship with their fathers, they generally love their fathers, but there's one area of longing, and that is wanting more emotional connection. And then I talk to adult fathers who also want more emotional connection with their children, but both parties are often feeling awkward about how to go about it. And so yeah, this hurts our relationships. It hurts our intimacy with our partners as well.
Since Brandon just talked about how rigid and restrictive masculinity limits men's fulfillment as sons and dads, here's a snippet of a song he wrote called A Letter to Dad.
What did you have to shut down? What dreams did you hide? What would the boy inside you, given the chance, want to try? I don't know you like I ought to. Would you like to talk?
And then, of course, the need to be dominant really has a lot of negative outcomes for others, like higher rates of sexual harassment, assault, violence, more likely to believe rape myths. Yeah, a host of negative outcomes. And so that is restrictive masculinity. Toxic masculinity is one, it's not effective. Like, most people don't know the term. I think that, and what I mean by know the terms, they know about the term, but it doesn't also match, because boys I've talked to are like really confused about, like, so it's toxic if I don't express my emotions. But then I have all these boys telling me when I started to suppress my emotions, I got bullied less in school, or I suppressed my emotions because it was not safe for me to express them at home, or my parents were going through so much they couldn't handle what was going on in my life, or I thought they couldn't. And so it doesn't, like, it just feels gross to me to actually call that toxic when that's not really the upstream effect.
Okay, so he talked about the pressure to suppress one's emotions and to be dominant. I was curious about the pressure to be hyper-independent. I mean, everything in the world is interconnected, so interdependent. I depend on people growing food and making water available in my home, and on trillions of microorganisms making nutrients available to me, and on plants that produce the oxygen that my brain needs to function. So I think aiming to be hyper-independent is a lost battle, but how is it harmful to men?
Well, one of the best predictors of living a long life is being connected to close community throughout your life. So humans are designed, we're social creatures. And so again, being independent is a skill that we want. I think as a former high school teacher, we want our students to be more independent in so many ways, to be more resilient. And one of the best ways to build resiliency is facing challenges with support, but not avoiding the challenges. And so hyper-independence, again, very protective, because maybe you learn that no one else is going to help you. And but then it's very difficult to have a really satisfying relationship with someone else if you don't know how to actually depend on one another in a not codependent way, but in a really healthy way. This is really difficult for a lot of
And that
humans.
happens a lot in men. I've heard a lot about, like, after divorce, men go lonelier than women because during their marriage or their relationship, they would basically depend on their partner's social life to have a social life or to organize their social life. And once the partner's gone, they discover that they don't have the skills to do that by themselves. And
Yeah, I'm familiar with the research of widows, of male widows fare worse, and female widows tend to have actually a higher level of happiness after their partner dies. And so, which is a really sad stat. And there's also really high suicide rates for men over 65. And part of that, like, so many factors with suicide, but part of it is men having a primary role as the breadwinner and having having to figure out a new sense of purpose can be very difficult. But also what you mentioned is that there is a lot of men in different generations, more so, but a lot of men are very lonely today, don't have significant friendships, don't feel like anyone in their life really knows them well. And so when you do have that, sometimes you rely on your partner and the woman being the emotional safe haven for yourself, but also, yeah, your friendship circle and community. And so without, like, my wife and some of our close friends, there was like a time early on in our marriage where the two women were like planning like a hangout for us, and they're like, why are we planning a hangout for you? And And they're
play
absolutely
date.
correct. Yeah, essentially, it's like, we should text about this. So like I could absolutely see that temptation within, or that default, if I didn't check it within inside my own relationships.
When I think about the toxic traits of masculinity, of course, I think of the harms it can do to others, but I also think about how men have historically been taught that it's manly to sacrifice your body for an often senseless war. And if you survive the war, then it's probably your mental health you've sacrificed now that you might suffer from severe PTSD. And a milder form of that is just how they're taught to sacrifice their time, health, and creativity to be mostly providers. I've heard men say that their sole value as men is to struggle and fight to reach a better position or status so they can make enough money to support their family. What if we cut them some slack and distributed these roles a bit better so that men can feel like men and just good about themselves without having to sacrifice their minds and bodies? And another thing, men are sold a supposedly manly lifestyle that's actually pretty unhealthy. It's manly to drive fast, and so men die in and cause more car accidents than women. It's manly to drink a lot of alcohol, even though, as far as we know, no amount of alcohol is safe for human health. It's manly to beat someone up or engage in this kind of behaviors that can lead them to prison, where they can be exposed to horrible violence. And they're not the only ones who pay the price. Everyone suffers when half the population is groomed into being toxic to themselves and others. And for me, that's part of how society fails men and everyone else, really. So if you're tired of people just stating that without offering solutions, come back for part 2 because we'll talk about how men can thrive and feel like men without losing parts of themselves to fit in a tight box. And I also have a movie recommendation for you. Here's a snippet.
Financial provision can absolutely bring safety to some people. Me working out, that actually in a weird roundabout way does fulfill a sense of safety inside of myself, because it's not because having muscles makes me feel safe. But I do feel that when I do work out consistently, I'm actually building safety within my own system, that I'm going to follow through on something that I say I'm going to do.
In the meantime, you can get some extra information at the end of the episode, and I highly recommend Brendan's Instagram account, re.masculine. I hope you got some valuable insights from this episode, and if you want to learn more from my guests, you'll find everything you need in the show notes. I, for one, thank you for your attention. I know you could have been watching or listening to a billion other things, and I'm glad you picked this one. Now, 3 things before I leave you. Number 1, if you liked the music you heard today, you should look me up on the music platform you use. There will also be a link in the show notes to help you find me on there. Number 2, if you want to help me make the internet a place for more constructive and nuanced conversations, you can subscribe, like the episode, share it, and leave a comment or review depending on where you're listening to this. And number 3, you can also subscribe to my free Patreon, to my free newsletter Night Sky, and follow me on Instagram or TikTok to understand a bit better the messages behind my songs. Again, everything will be in the show notes. All right? Thank you, and take care, and keep trying to make sense.